The day my wife, Carol, died, I lost the only person who truly understood me. When I called our son to tell him, his response wasn't grief. It was an inconvenience. He chose a vacation in Europe over his own mother's funeral. He came back weeks later expecting to inherit a fortune. What he didn't know is that Carol's final act of love wasn't for him. It was a perfectly laid trap hidden in plain sight in her will. And I was the one who was going to spring it. Before I tell you how a simple garden became the ultimate lesson in greed, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And please like and subscribe if you believe a person's true worth is measured by more than just money. The silence in our house was a physical thing. It had weight. It pressed down on me from the ceiling and rose up from the floorboards. I sat in my old leather armchair, the one I'd been sitting in for 40 years, and held the phone to my ear. My other hand rested on the worn fabric of her armchair right next to mine. It was empty. The indentation where she always sat was still there, a ghost of her presence in the faded floral pattern. I could almost feel the warmth of her, but it was just a memory. The phone felt cold against my skin. I had dialed the number 3 times before my thumb would finally press the call button. Now the ringing from a world away felt like an intrusion, a foreign noise in the sacred quiet of my grief. Finally he answered. "Kevin," I said, and my own voice sounded unfamiliar, a dry rustle of leaves. "It's your mother. She's gone." The line was quiet for a second, but it wasn't a respectful silence. It was the silence of someone trying to place a sound. Gone. Where, Dad? I'm in a rush. I could hear the tinny echo of an airport, the muffled voice of an announcer calling out gate numbers. "Jess's flight is boarding. She's gone, Kevin." I said it again, forcing the words out, making them clear and sharp. "She passed away. Last night. Her heart." Another pause. This one was longer. I heard him sigh, a sound of pure exasperation, not sadness. It was the sound a man makes when his train is delayed. "Come on, Dad. Don't be so dramatic. The doctor said this could happen. It's not a surprise." His voice was clipped efficient. "Look, I really can't cancel this trip. Jess needs me for this tour in Europe. It's a huge deal for her brand. We'll be back in a few weeks. We can sort everything out then." Sort everything out. Those were his words. As if his mother's life, our life together, was just a messy desk to be tidied up. Before I could find a response, before I could find the air in my own lungs, he spoke again. "I gotta go, Dad. Talk later." And then he was gone. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear and placed it on the table beside me. The click of plastic on wood was the loudest sound I had ever heard. My grief wasn't just my own anymore. It was a burden he had refused to help me carry, a package he had handed back to me as if it were addressed to the wrong person. In that moment, the loss of my wife felt like a wound, but my son's words, that was the salt. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there, my hand still resting on her empty chair. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, forgotten world. This house, our home for 4 decades, had always felt alive, filled with the sound of her humming in the kitchen, the scent of the roses she grew, the quiet rustle of her turning the page of a book. Now it was just a collection of rooms, a museum of a life that was over. Eventually I stood up. My knees ached. I walked through the quiet space, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Each object was a memory, a story. On the windowsill, her gardening gloves lay palm up, still holding the shape of her hands, a light dusting of soil on the fingertips. She loved that garden more than anything. It was her sanctuary, her canvas. Her book lay face down on the end table, a bookmark halfway through. A history of Roman aqueducts. She was always learning, always curious. She used to say that a mind that stops learning starts dying. I ran my fingers over the cover, a silent conversation with the woman who was no longer there to answer. I walked into the kitchen. The coffee pot was still half full from the morning. Our morning. The last one. I hadn't known it was the last. You never do. I stood at the sink and looked out at her garden, the roses and the lavender, and the sturdy oak tree we planted when Kevin was born. Tears came, but they weren't the loud, ragged kind. They were silent, hot trails on my face, a language only the lonely understand. I was completely and utterly alone. And in that crushing loneliness, something else began to stir. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a cold, hard resolve. A decision formed not in my mind, but in my bones. I would do this alone. I would handle the arrangements. I would honor her memory the right way, whatever it took. My son had made his choice. Now I had to make mine. The air in the funeral home was thick with the scent of lilies and polite grief. It was a small gathering, just as Carol would have wanted. A few of our oldest friends' neighbors who had become family over the years, the quiet hum of their hushed conversations, a small comfort against the vast emptiness. I stood near the polished wood of her casket, my hand resting on its surface, feeling the cold, hard finality of it. I thanked people for coming, shook their hands, and accepted their condolences with a nod, because words felt like stones in my throat. But the silence in the first row was the loudest sound in the room. The space reserved for family, for our son. It remained empty. People were too kind to stare, but I could feel their glances, the soft, questioning looks they tried to hide. It was a shame that felt hot and heavy on my shoulders, a second kind of mourning. My oldest friend George came and stood beside me. He had been the best man at my wedding. He put a heavy hand on my shoulder. His was a friendship that didn't need many words, but today he had to ask. He gestured with a slight nod towards the empty pew. "Where's Kevin Frank?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. I couldn't look at him. I just stared at the bouquet of white roses on the casket, Carol's favorite. I shook my head, a small, barely perceptible movement. A universe of disappointment and failure was contained in that simple gesture. I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't say, "He's in Europe, George. He chose a business trip over his mother." So I said nothing. The shame was a private language, and I was its only speaker. Later, as people were leaving, Mary Carol's friend from her book club squeezed my arm. Her eyes were sad, not just for Carol, but for me. "She worried about him, you know," she whispered so only I could hear. "She said he was building his house on a foundation of appearances. She always said one good storm would bring it all down." Her words were meant to be a comfort, a shared secret about my son's nature. But they only confirmed what I already knew. Carol had seen it all. She had understood the truth of our son long before I was willing to accept it. That evening, back in the crushing silence of the house, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. For a wild, foolish moment, I thought it might be him, calling to apologize, calling to grieve with me. The screen lit up. A message from Kevin. It didn't say, "How are you holding up?" It didn't say, "Thinking of you." It said, "Dad, sorry about that. Europe is a mess of meetings. Handle the funeral bills for now. I'll settle up with the estate later." I read the message twice. The words were simple, practical, and they were the cruelest words I had ever read. It wasn't a dagger in the heart. It was a slow, cold press of steel. Settle up with the estate. He had already turned his mother into a line item, a financial problem to be solved. He had put her memory in a ledger right next to catering and floral arrangements. That was when the grief for a moment turned into something else, something colder, something harder. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and quiet. The sympathy cards stopped arriving. The casseroles in the freezer dwindled. The house settled back into its silence, but it was a different kind now. It was waiting. I knew there were things I had to do, practical things, Carol had handled all our finances, our plans. Her office was the one room I had avoided. It was the most her room in the house, filled with her books, her neat stacks of paper, the faint scent of the lavender she kept in a small vase on her desk. Finally, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I opened the door, and the afternoon light streamed in, illuminating her world. It was tidy, organized, just like her mind. I sat in her chair, feeling small and out of place. I didn't know where to begin. Starting to sort through a person's life feels like a betrayal. Each file I touched, each book I moved felt like a conversation I was having without her. Her desk was a large oak partner's desk. My side was mostly empty, but hers was a testament to her life. I started with the top drawer, old checkbooks, pens, stationery. Nothing important. Then I saw it. Tucked in the back, a small polished maple box. I had seen it on her desk for years, but had never thought to ask what was inside. I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was not jewelry, but a set of old heavy keys, brass with intricate heads. They were for locks I didn't recognize. Beneath the keys was a leather-bound notebook. I opened it. It wasn't a diary filled with emotions. It was a ledger of her secret financial life. Small investments I never knew. She made careful notes on market trends. She was brilliant. And then I saw it, pages dedicated to a single purchase made 15 years ago, a plot of land in West Creek. The notes described it as overlooked and full of potential. I vaguely remembered her mentioning it. I'd dismissed it as one of her little projects. To me, it just seemed like a worthless patch of dirt near an old industrial park. At the bottom of the box, I found a thick, cream-colored envelope. My name was on the front, written in her elegant script. Below my name, she had written a single sentence, "Only open when you truly need to know where our most important garden is." I held the letter in my hands. The paper was heavy, important. I didn't open it. Not yet. It didn't feel like the right time. But holding it, I felt a change in the room. A change in me. The crushing weight of grief had not lifted, but it had shifted. Now it had a direction. My wife had been a planner. She had seen the world with clear eyes, including the world of our own family. Carol had left me more than memories. She had left me a map. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I was meant to follow it. The days that followed the funeral were a blur of paperwork and quiet. The sympathy cards stopped arriving. The casseroles in the freezer dwindled. The house settled back into its silence, but it was a different kind now. It was waiting. I knew there were things I had to do, practical things. Carol had handled all our finances, our plans. Her office was the one room I had avoided. It was the most her room in the house, filled with her books, her neat stacks of paper, the faint scent of the lavender she kept in a small vase on her desk. It was the heart of her world, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face it without her. Finally, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I opened the door, and the afternoon light streamed in, illuminating her world. It was tidy, organized, just like her mind. A thriving fern sat on the corner of her desk, its leaves a vibrant green. She had loved tending to her plants. I sat in her chair, a worn leather seat that still held the faint impression of her own. It felt small and out of place to be there. I didn't know where to begin. Starting to sort through a person's life feels like a betrayal. Each file I touched, each book I moved felt like a conversation I was having without her. Her desk was a large oak partner's desk. My side was mostly empty, but hers was a testament to her life. I started with the top drawer. Old checkbooks, pens, stationery. Nothing important. My eyes landed on a small, polished maple box that had sat on the corner of her desk for as long as I could remember. It was one of those objects you see every day until you truly look at it for the first time. I had always assumed it held old pins or keepsakes. I had never once asked her what was inside. I pulled it towards me. The wood was smooth and cool under my fingertips. I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was not jewelry. The first thing I saw was a set of old, heavy keys. They were brass with intricate, old-fashioned heads tied together with a simple piece of twine. They were for locks I didn't recognize. There were no labels, no clues as to what doors they might open. They were a silent, heavy question. Beneath the keys was a leather-bound notebook. It was worn at the edges from use. I opened it. It wasn't a diary filled with emotions. It was a ledger, a meticulous record of her secret financial life. There were small investments I never knew. She made careful notes on market trends, clippings from financial papers. She was brilliant. I saw entries tracking the growth of our retirement fund, notes about diversifying our assets. She had been the silent architect of our security, and I had simply enjoyed the house she had built. Then I saw it. Several pages were dedicated to a single purchase made 15 years ago, a plot of land in West Creek. I remembered it now vaguely. She had been excited about it, talking about getting it for a bargain at a county auction. I had dismissed it. It was in a forgotten part of the county near an old shut-down industrial park. I had thought it was just one of her little projects, a hobby. But here in her ledger, it was no hobby. There were copies of the deed property tax receipts paid every year, without fail, and handwritten notes. One note described the land as overlooked and full of potential. Another simply said, "Patience is the most important fertilizer." At the very bottom of the box underneath the ledger, I found a thick, cream-colored envelope. My name was on the front, written in her elegant, familiar script. My heart caught in my throat. Below my name, she had written a single sentence, a careful instruction. "Only open when you truly need to know where our most important garden is." I held the letter in my hands. The paper was heavy important. Her words echoed in my mind. Our most important garden. I thought of the rose beds outside the vegetable patch we tended every summer. But I knew instinctively that she meant something else entirely. I didn't open the letter. Not yet. It didn't feel like the right time. The instruction was clear. I didn't truly need to know, not yet. But holding that sealed envelope, I felt a change in the room, a change in me. The crushing weight of grief had not lifted, but it had shifted. Now it had a direction. My wife had been a planner. She had seen the world with clear eyes, including the world of our own family. Carol had left me more than memories. She had left me a map, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I was meant to follow it. 3 weeks to the day after the funeral, I heard the sound of a car engine that didn't belong in my quiet neighborhood. It wasn't the gentle hum of a neighbor's sedan. It was the low, aggressive purr of an expensive German SUV. I looked through the living room window and saw it pull into my driveway, its metallic gray paint gleaming in the sun. Kevin and Jessica were back. I watched them get out of the car. They didn't look like people returning from a period of mourning. They looked like they had stepped out of a travel magazine. Both were tanned, wearing expensive sunglasses. Jessica had a designer handbag slung over her shoulder that probably cost more than my first car. Kevin moved with a restless, confident energy, already talking on his phone before he even shut the car door. They were a vision of success and ambition, and they looked completely alien standing on the cracked concrete of the driveway I had poured with my own 2 hands 40 years ago. I opened the door before they had a chance to ring the bell. Jessica swept in first, bringing a cloud of expensive perfume with her, a scent that felt like an invader in a house that still smelled faintly of Carol's lemon polish. She gave me a quick, air-light hug, her cheek barely brushing mine. "Frank, darling, we are so sorry," she said, her voice a practiced, sympathetic murmur. "It must have been just awful for you." Her eyes, however, were not looking at me. They were scanning the living room, taking in the furniture, the paintings on the wall, her gaze lingering on a silver picture frame, as if she were calculating its value. Kevin followed, ending his phone call with a sharp, "I'll circle back on that." He gave me a firm, one-armed hug. "Tough time, Dad. Glad to be back to help you sort things out." He said the right words, but his tone was that of a manager arriving at a satellite office to fix a problem. He placed his leather briefcase on the floor next to Carol's empty armchair, and the sight of it so cold and professional in her space sent a chill through me. They sat on the sofa opposite me, a matched set of ambition and impatience. For a moment, we just looked at each other in the quiet room. Then Jessica leaned forward, placing her perfectly manicured hands on her knees. Her expression was one of serious concern, a mask she wore very well. "Frank," she began again, "we know this is difficult, but we have to be practical now for your sake. This house, it's just far too much for one person. All the upkeep, the memories. It's not healthy to be rattling around in a place this big all by yourself." I said nothing. I just watched her, letting the silence hang in the air. I saw her sympathetic smile begin to strain at the edges. Kevin took that as his cue to take over. He leaned forward, adopting a businesslike posture. "She's right, Dad. I've already spoken to a contact at Sotheby's. The market in this neighborhood is hot right now. We could get an incredible price for this place. We've been looking at some beautiful new condos downtown for you. Full-service concierge, a gym, everything taken care of. You wouldn't have to lift a finger. It would be a fresh start." I listened to them, to their well-rehearsed pitch. They spoke of my life as if it were a portfolio of assets to be managed. They used words like liquidate when they talked about my home and optimize when they talked about Carol's possessions. They laid out a neat and tidy plan for the rest of my life, a life designed by them for their convenience. Not once did they ask what I wanted. Not once did they mention Carol's name with any real warmth. They didn't talk about her laugh or the way she loved the morning glories that climbed the trellis outside. They didn't recall a single memory. They only saw what she had left behind. They saw dollar signs where I saw a life. I looked at my son, at the expensive watch on his wrist, and the confident set of his jaw. This was the man who had been too busy for his mother's funeral, but had found the time to consult a real estate agent about her house before her body was even cold. The realization settled over me not with a crash, but with a quiet, solid finality. They weren't just thoughtless. They were predators, and their mother's death was simply the opportunity they had been waiting for. I kept my hands resting on the arms of my chair. I kept my face calm. I let them talk, let them lay out their entire greedy vision for my future. I let them reveal the full, unvarnished truth of who they were. And as I listened, the grief inside me did not shrink, but it made room for something else. The cold, hard resolve I had felt after the funeral now had a name. It was a duty to my wife, to the life we had built, and to the final brilliant lesson she had left behind for a son who desperately needed to learn it. I let the silence stretch after Kevin finished his proposal. I just looked at them, my quiet gaze moving from my son to his wife. They started to shift uncomfortably, their confident smiles faltering. They had expected an argument, or maybe grateful acceptance. They did not know how to interpret my silence. They couldn't know that in my mind I was no longer listening to them. I was thinking of a wooden box, a set of old keys, and a sealed letter from my wife. Their planning was over. Mine was just beginning. After they left, the house felt contaminated. The aggressive purr of their SUV faded down the street, but the scent of Jessica's perfume lingered in the air, a cloying artificial sweetness that didn't belong. I stood in the living room for a long time, looking at the spot on the floor where Kevin's briefcase had rested. It was an insult, a declaration of intent. They had come into our home not to share in a loss, but to calculate a profit. That was the final push, the last piece of evidence I needed. My hesitation was gone, burned away by the cold fire of their greed. I walked directly to Carol's office. The afternoon sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the room. I didn't turn on the light. I went straight to her desk, opened the maple box, and took out the cream-colored envelope. My name was on the front, written in her steady, elegant hand. My hands, I noticed, were perfectly still. The tremor I had felt for weeks was gone. I slid my finger under the seal and broke it. The sound was a soft, final tear. I unfolded the heavy pages within. My dearest Frank, she had written. If you are reading this, then I am gone and I am sorry. I am sorry for the silence I have left behind and for the pain you must be feeling. Please know that my last thought was of you, of our life, of the home we built, not with wood and nails, but with laughter and patience. But I am also writing this because I know you and I know our son. I love him, Frank. I will always love the little boy who collected rocks and believed in magic. But I do not have illusions about the man he has become. He is a man who measures the world in square feet and dollar signs. He sees value, but he does not understand worth. I fear that when I am gone, he will see our life together as an asset to be liquidated. He will descend upon our home not as a grieving son, but as a businessman closing a deal. I cannot bear the thought of him erasing our history for a commission. I cannot let my legacy, our legacy, become nothing more than a number in his bank account. So I have made a plan. A better one. Do you remember that small, forgotten plot of land I bought in West Creek all those years ago? You thought I was silly. You called it my patch of weeds. But I saw something else, Frank. I saw potential. For years I have been working quietly. The enclosed documents will explain everything, but the heart of it is this: I have laid the groundwork to turn that worthless land into a public garden, a community space, the Carol Miller Memorial Garden, a place where children can play and old couples can sit in the sun, a place that grows. This is my will, Frank. Not the legal document the lawyers will read, but my true and final wish. Our son will get his inheritance, but he will not get to cash it in. He will have to build something beautiful to get it. He will have to create, not just consume. I have put everything in place. I have already met with the lawyers, with city planners, with a wonderful nonprofit called City Blooms. They are all waiting. All they need is the final signal. From you. This is a heavy burden to place on your shoulders, my love. But I trust you. You were always the engineer, the one who knew how to build things that last. Build this for me. Build this for us. Let this be our most important garden. All my love forever, Carol. I read the letter 3 times. The pages trembled in my hand, not from weakness, but from the force of her words, her incredible foresight, her fierce protective love. She had seen it all. She had known. And she had not despaired. She had planned. She had built a fortress around her legacy. A fortress made of legal documents and nonprofit partnerships. She had left me the keys to the gate. The grief in my chest was still there, a deep, resonant ache. But now it was surrounded by awe. I looked at her portrait on the wall, the one taken on our 40th anniversary. She was smiling, a knowing, gentle smile. Of course, I whispered to the empty room. Of course you did. The next morning, I put on my best suit. I took the old brass keys from the maple box, and I drove to the First National Bank downtown. The silence of the vault was absolute, a cold, metallic quiet. The bank officer, a young man with a polite, professional demeanor, led me to safe deposit box number 734. I slid one of the heavy, ornate keys into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, solid click. The officer used his own key, and the small metal door swung open. He left me alone in the small private room. The box was heavy. I placed it on the table and lifted the lid. It was exactly as she had promised. There were no jewels, no hidden cash. It was better. It was ammunition. There was the original notarized deed to the West Creek property. There were architectural blueprints for a park beautifully rendered with pathways, benches, and a small children's playground. There was a thick file of correspondence with the City Blooms organization. And at the bottom, there was a set of contracts pre-signed by Carol, legally binding agreements with a landscape architecture firm and a construction company detailing the full scope and budget for the project. She had left nothing to chance. I sat there for an hour, reading through everything, absorbing the sheer brilliance of her plan. She hadn't just left a wish. She had left a complete, ready-to-execute project. When I walked out of the bank, I was no longer just Frank Miller, a grieving widower. I was the executor of the Carol Miller Memorial Garden. I went home and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Mr. Davis, our family lawyer. His voice was full of gentle sympathy when he answered, but my tone was different now. "Mr. Davis, this is Frank Miller," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I need to schedule an official reading of my wife's will. I have some additional documents from her safe deposit box that need to be presented at that time." He was surprised by my directness, but he agreed. We set the meeting for Friday at 10 a.m. The second call was to Kevin. He answered on the second ring, his voice impatient. "Dad." "What's up?" I kept my voice neutral, even a little tired. "Kevin, I've thought about what you and Jessica said. You're right. We need to handle this properly. I've spoken with Mr. Davis. We're going to have the official reading of the will this Friday at his office. 10 o'clock. Be there." I could almost hear the smile of triumph in his voice. "Of course, Dad. That's a great idea. Very efficient. We'll be there." He thought I had surrendered. He thought the old man had finally seen reason and was ready to hand over the keys to the kingdom. He had no idea that I was just handing him the keys to a cage Carol had designed herself. I hung up the phone and looked at her picture again. A silent promise passed between us. The stage was set. The law firm of Davis Albright and Finch was on the 40th floor of a glass and steel tower downtown, the kind of place where the silence is expensive. The carpets were so thick they swallowed the sound of my footsteps. Polished mahogany walls reflected a distorted version of the city skyline outside the panoramic windows. This was Kevin's world, a world built on billable hours and power lunches. I felt like a visitor from another planet, in my simple, dark gray suit, the one I had worn to weddings and funerals for the last 20 years. It was clean and pressed, but it was a relic of a different time, a different set of values. I was not intimidated. I was just observant. I was shown to a large conference room. Mr. Davis, a man in his 60s with a calm, professional demeanor, stood to greet me. He shook my hand, his expression unreadable. "Frank, thank you for coming." I sat at the long, polished table, my back to the window, and waited. Kevin and Jessica arrived exactly at 10 o'clock. They didn't walk in. They made an entrance. Kevin was in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment used to be. Jessica wore a sharp, cream-colored dress, her jewelry simple but clearly expensive. They moved with an easy confidence, completely at home in this environment of quiet power. Kevin greeted Mr. Davis not like a family lawyer, but like a business associate, a firm handshake and a confident smile. Jessica nodded politely in my direction, a queen acknowledging a commoner. They took their seats on the opposite side of the table, placing their phones face down in a synchronized business-like gesture. They were a team, and they were here to close the deal. Mr. Davis cleared his throat and put on a pair of reading glasses. He sat at the head of the table, placing a thick, leather-bound document in front of him. "All right," he said, his voice filling the quiet room. "We are here today for the official reading of the last will and testament of Carol Ann Miller." He looked at each of us in turn. "As per her instructions, I will read the document in its entirety." Kevin leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs. He gave Jessica a small, confident smirk. He was ready for the main event. He believed he knew exactly how this was going to go. Mr. Davis opened the document. The first part was standard legal language, a recitation of names and affirmations of sound mind. Then he moved on to the bequests of personal effects. He began. To my dear friend Mary Evans, I leave my collection of first edition novels. My hope is that they will bring her as much joy in the reading as they brought me in the collecting. I saw Kevin tap his fingers on the polished wood of the table. A slow, impatient rhythm. Mr. Davis continued. To our lifelong friend and neighbor George Henderson, I bequeath my prized rose bushes from the east side of the garden with the request that he transplant them to his own garden, so that they may continue to flourish. Kevin let out a soft, barely audible sigh. He glanced at his watch, a sliver of polished steel on his wrist. To the Fairfield Public Library, an institution that brought me immense joy throughout my life, I donate the sum of $5,000 to be used for the acquisition of new books for the history department. Jessica shifted in her seat. She exchanged a quick, meaningful look with her husband. The look was clear. This is all very quaint, but can we please get to the part that matters? The part with the large numbers. I just sat there, my hands resting in my lap. I watched my son. I saw the impatience radiating from him. He had no time for these sentimental gestures, for these small pieces of his mother's life being given away. To him, this was all just fluff, the boring opening act before the headliner. He saw her books, her roses, her love of history as trivialities. He had no understanding that these small things were the very fabric of who she was. He was waiting for the real inheritance, the one that could be measured and sold. He checked his phone under the table. I felt a profound sadness, but it was a clear, sharp sadness, not a cloudy one. I saw him exactly as his mother had, and I knew with absolute certainty that what was about to happen was not an act of revenge. It was an act of correction. A final lesson from a teacher who had loved her student even when he refused to learn. Mr. Davis turned a page. The rustle of the thick paper seemed to echo in the room. He had finished with the minor bequests. The time for sentiment was over. Mr. Davis paused, took a sip of water from a glass on the table, and then picked up the final, most important section of the will. His office was so quiet, I could hear the faint click of the pen in Kevin's hand as he finally stopped tapping it. The air in the room was tight with anticipation. Jessica sat perfectly still, her back straight, a picture of poised expectation. They were leaning in, ready to receive their prize. Now, Mr. Davis said, his voice steady and formal, we come to the disposition of the primary assets and real estate holdings of the Miller estate. He began to read. I, Carol Ann Miller, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my remaining estate to my sole surviving heir, my son, Kevin Michael Miller. He paused, looking over his glasses. This includes, but is not limited to, the family residence at 45 Orchard Lane, all stocks, bonds, and securities held in my name, and the contents of all savings and checking accounts. It was done. The words hung in the air, simple and direct. I watched as a slow, triumphant smile spread across Kevin's face. He reached a hand under the table, and I saw his fingers intertwine with Jessica's. She turned to him, her eyes shining with victory. It was a shared, silent celebration. They had won. They had weathered the boring parts, and now the kingdom was theirs. I could see the calculations already happening behind their eyes, the numbers spinning, the plans for selling the house already solidifying. I remained perfectly still, watching them, letting them have their moment. In a great play, there must be a moment when the villain believes he has succeeded completely. Mr. Davis cleared his throat again. The sound cut through their silent victory lap. Kevin's smile didn't vanish, but it froze in place. However, Mr. Davis said, and that one word changed the gravity in the room. This bequest is contingent upon one single binding condition. A codicil which is irrevocable and central to the execution of this will. Kevin's hand tightened on Jessica's. The smile was gone now, replaced by a flicker of confusion. A condition? He asked, his voice a little sharp. What kind of condition? Mr. Davis ignored the interruption and continued to read from the will, his voice a calm, implacable drone. This inheritance is granted on the express condition that the sole heir, Kevin Michael Miller, shall oversee and ensure the full and complete execution of my final project, the establishment and construction of the Carol Miller Memorial Garden. He let the words settle. I saw Kevin and Jessica exchange a baffled look. A memorial garden. It sounded like a trivial, sentimental request. Mr. Davis continued. This garden is to be built on the property owned by the estate located at Lot 4B in the West Creek district. Kevin almost laughed. West Creek, that worthless patch of dirt, that's the condition to build some flower beds. He waved a dismissive hand. Fine, whatever. We'll hire a landscaper. Done. I remained silent. The hook was set. Now came the line. The will is very specific regarding the execution of the project, Mr. Davis said, his eyes still fixed on the page. All costs associated with the planning, development, and construction of the Carol Miller Memorial Garden, as detailed in the associated planning documents, shall be drawn directly and exclusively from the liquid assets within the estate. This includes all cash holdings and the sale of all stocks and securities. The color began to drain from Jessica's face. Kevin's confident posture deflated. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. What? What associated documents? What costs? This was my cue to watch my wife's genius unfold. Mr. Davis reached down beside his chair and lifted a thick 4-inch binder, placing it on the center of the table. The sound it made, a solid, heavy thud, seemed to shake the entire room. On the spine, a simple label read, CMMG Project Plan. These are the documents, Mr. Davis said calmly. He tapped the binder. Inside, you will find the complete architectural blueprints, all necessary city permits, which Mrs. Miller secured over the last 5 years, and legally binding contracts pre-signed by your mother with the Greenleaf Landscape Architecture firm and the nonprofit organization City Blooms, who will act as project consultants. He paused, letting them stare at the binder as if it were a bomb. And as for the costs, he said, turning to the final page of the will, the budget for the project is contractually fixed. The total legally obligated cost for the completion of the Carol Miller Memorial Garden is $1,500,000. Silence. Absolute stunned silence. Jessica's mouth was slightly open. Kevin stared at the binder, then at the lawyer, then at me. His face was a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. 1.5 million, he stammered. The words were a puff of air. That's almost all of it. That's everything. All the cash, the entire investment portfolio. That is correct, Mr. Davis said. No, Kevin said, shaking his head, his voice rising. No, we'll contest it. She wasn't of sound mind. This is ridiculous. Mr. Davis held up a hand. I would advise against that, Kevin. The will is ironclad. It has been reviewed by 3 separate legal experts. Your mother was in perfect mental health when she drafted this codicil 2 years ago, and we have the psychiatric evaluations to prove it. He leaned forward slightly. And there is one final clause. He read from the page one last time. Should my heir, Kevin Michael Miller, refuse to accept this condition or fail to execute the project in good faith, the inheritance is considered forfeit. In such a case, the entirety of the estate, including the family residence, shall be transferred immediately and in full to the City Blooms organization, who will then be legally empowered to liquidate all assets as they see fit to fund the completion of the memorial garden themselves. The trap was sprung. The genius of it was breathtaking. He couldn't touch the money because the money was already spent. He was left with a house he would have to pay taxes on and a legal obligation to spend his entire cash inheritance building a monument to the mother he had ignored. If he accepted, he got the house, but he would be financially bound to her legacy. If he refused, he would get absolutely nothing, not a penny, not a single brick from the house he grew up in. He was checkmated. I looked at my son. The confident, arrogant businessman was gone. In his place was a pale, sweating man staring at a binder full of his mother's plans. He had come here to claim his prize, and instead, Carol had handed him a shovel. The weeks following the reading of the will were quiet. Kevin and Jessica didn't call. There were no angry voicemails, no desperate appeals. There was nothing they could do. The legal document my wife had constructed was a perfect cage, and they were trapped inside it. They had made their choice. They accepted the inheritance because the alternative, getting nothing at all, was unthinkable to them. And so they became the unwilling patrons of the Carol Miller Memorial Garden. 3 months later, I drove out to the West Creek property. The change was astonishing. The field of weeds I remembered was gone. In its place was a landscape of possibility. Bulldozers had carved gentle slopes into the earth. Trenches for irrigation pipes crisscrossed the dark soil like veins. A team of workers was laying the stone foundation for a small pavilion. It was a place of noise and energy, the sound of creation. I wore a hard hat, something I hadn't done in years. It felt good. As a retired civil engineer, this was a language I understood. I stood with the site foreman looking over the blueprints, the very same ones I had first seen in the safe deposit box. The lines on the paper were becoming real. And then I saw him. Standing near the edge of the property next to his gleaming SUV was Kevin. He was on the phone, pacing back and forth. He was wearing an expensive suit, but it looked ridiculous here. There was a smudge of mud on his polished Italian shoes. He was legally required to make a site visit once a week. This was his prison. He looked tired and angry, a man completely out of his element, surrounded by the honest work of building something he wanted no part of. His inheritance wasn't the house he now owned but rarely visited. It was this field of dirt and sweat. He had to watch week after week as his cash windfall was transformed into something beautiful for strangers. He had the asset, the house, but he had lost what he truly craved, the easy money. He never looked my way. I didn't need him to. The lesson was being taught, whether he was willing to learn it or not. 6 months after that, the sounds of construction had been replaced by the rustle of new leaves. I came to the park on a bright, clear afternoon. The transformation was complete. Young trees lined the new pathways. The playground was filled with the laughter of children. An elderly couple sat on a bench sharing a newspaper in the sun. The air smelled of fresh mulch and blooming flowers. It was more beautiful than even the blueprints had promised. It was alive. I walked down a path paved with gray stones and found the bench I was looking for. It was tucked away in a quiet corner, beneath the shade of a young oak tree, looking out over a bed of Carol's favorite white roses. On a small brass plaque, an inscription read, "Frank and Carol Miller, forever." I sat down, the sun warm on my face. I thought about the fury on my son's face in the lawyer's office and the bitter resentment I had seen on him at the construction site. I felt no triumph. I felt no anger. I only felt a profound sense of peace. Carol hadn't left behind a trap for our son. A trap is meant to destroy. This was a classroom. She didn't leave him money because she knew he didn't understand its true purpose. Money is like water. You can let it stagnate in a pool, or you can use it to water a garden. Kevin only ever wanted the pool, so Carol chose to water the garden for him. He will likely never understand. He will continue to see the world in square feet and dollar signs. But that no longer matters. Because this place, this garden, understands. The children laughing on the swings understand. The old couple reading their paper understand. A legacy isn't what you leave for your family. Sometimes it's what you leave for the world in spite of your family. It is not a monument to wealth, but a testament to worth. And worth is measured in the shade a tree provides, in the laughter of a child, in the quiet moment of peace it gives to a stranger. I ran my hand over the cool brass of the plaque, over her name next to mine. In the end, my wife didn't really pass away. She just found a different way to grow. and all around me in the rustling leaves and the fragrant blossoms she was blooming. 6 months after that, the sounds of construction had been replaced by the rustle of new leaves and the distant laughter of children. I came to the park on a bright, clear afternoon. The transformation was complete. Young trees lined the new pathways, their branches reaching for the sun. The playground was filled with families. An elderly couple sat on a bench, sharing a newspaper. The air smelled of fresh mulch and blooming flowers. It was more beautiful than even the blueprints had promised. It was alive. I walked down a path paved with gray stones and found the bench I was looking for. It was tucked away in a quiet corner beneath the shade of a young oak tree, looking out over a bed of Carol's favorite white roses. On a small brass plaque, an inscription read, "Frank and Carol Miller, forever." I sat down, the sun warm on my face. I thought about the fury on my son's face in the lawyer's office and the bitter resentment I had seen on him at the construction site. I felt no triumph. I felt no anger. I only felt a profound sense of peace. He didn't need to hear another word from me. Carol's actions had said everything that ever needed to be said. Carol didn't leave our son money. She left him a choice. The choice between the value of a dollar bill and the worth of a single leaf. She knew he would never understand the difference. He would always choose the paper. But this garden understands. The people who come here, the ones seeking a moment of quiet in their busy day, they will understand. A legacy isn't what you leave for your family. Sometimes it's what you leave for the world in spite of your family. It is not a monument to wealth, but a testament to worth. And worth is measured in the shade a tree provides, in the laughter of a child, in the quiet moment of peace it gives to a stranger. I ran my hand over the cool brass of the plaque, over her name next to mine. In the quiet of this place, I could hear her voice more clearly than ever. She didn't truly leave. She just found a different way to grow. And all around me in the rustling leaves and the fragrant blossoms she was blooming. I smiled a real smile and felt the warmth of the sun on my face. The story wasn't over. It was just getting started. This story reveals that the greatest inheritance isn't money, but a lesson in what truly matters. It teaches that legacy is built from purpose and love, not just assets. By choosing to create something beautiful for the community, a quiet man taught his greedy son a powerful lesson about worth over wealth. What do you think is the most important legacy a person can leave behind? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below.